Hey there and welcome back to another Stranger Things video. And a bit over a month ago, we saw the conclusion of Season 4 of Stranger Things with the release of its second volume. And spoilers ahead for anybody that actually cares about that sort of thing anymore. But of course, there were some pretty important plot developments that revealed over the course of the season, and especially in that volume too. Nancy and Jonathan's relationship is currently on the rocks and seems destined for even more angst, as the last thing he did was lie to her about applying to the college she got into. Hopper's made his long-awaited return and reunited with Al after their separation at the end of Season 3. Eddie's dead. And so was Max, very briefly, before Al restarted her heart with her powers, and now she's brain dead in hospital with no timeline on when she's going to recover. Hawkins has pretty much been destroyed and turned into a full-on disaster zone. A bunch of random citizens got vaporized in the aftermath of Vecna's attack. Homes destroyed, people displaced. And to top it all off, now there's a massive portal to the Upside Down in the middle of Hawkins, leaking out all that nasty shit, and paving a way for an army of beasties to make their way into the real world. Also, that terrible dust that takes over your mind and makes you into a slave of Vecna like Will in Season 2 and Billy and the Flayed in Season 3, that shit's just wafting through the portal into Hawkins. So really, at this point in time, it can't get much worse for the world, and for our characters. The story has reached its finale, that last chapter. It's all building to that final climactic confrontation with Vecna, who previously got clapped by Steve, Nancy and Robin using Molotov cocktails and a shotgun, and then ran away with his tail between his legs. But obviously, he's going to be stronger next time. And that final battle is coming up. The battle where Eleven's obviously going to kill him and save the world, and some of our favourites might potentially find themselves on the proverbial chopping block. And of course, the Upside Down will also be closed off forever, unless one day they want to return to this story in a spin-off or a sequel or something like that, but we'll have to wait and see. And so, because of all that build-up and all that drama and development, and the imminent threat that the Upside Down poses, after all, each season usually finishes off with the portal being closed, or mostly closed, and the threat being neutralized for the time being. But here, we're finishing off with pretty much everything going to absolute shit, and the apocalypse on the horizon. The world is pretty much prepped for a final invasion by Vecna, but this time, on a much grander scale than anything he's tried up to this point. And because of all this dramatic tension, and all these dangling plot threads that feel like they need to be resolved pronto, you'd assume that Stranger Things 5 would pretty much pick up where the previous season left off, or at least some point pretty closely linked. Usually each season skips a couple of months ahead, sometimes almost a year, but for this ending, I feel like that type of skip is less likely to happen. Even a couple of months of a gap probably wouldn't make that much sense based on what's happened so far. But then again, we did see Vecna go through the ringer in that finale, so I'd be more willing to accept that he's simply wounded after his encounter at the end of the season, and that he needs time to recuperate from being set on fire and shot by trigger-happy teenagers with a hero complex. So I guess a couple of months rest seems fair. That's usually how these things go after all. And I think it's a gap that does technically make narrative sense. But in the aftermath of the season, there's been more and more talk of a more substantial time skip. One that lasts years and sees our characters age up significantly in the interim. And look, I don't know if this idea is actually in the works at all, and whether this potential plot point's ever going to become a reality, but enough people have said it that it leans into the maybe category. And for reference, the two big rumours that I've seen over time have been a skip to the early 90s or a skip to the late 80s. And those are two decently sized skips. And I guess if I had to choose between them, it would be the late 80s. I just don't see why a skip to the 90s would ever be in the cards. A big part of the show is that it's a throwback or a love letter to the 80s. Imagine having 4 seasons of that and then deciding, nah, let's wipe that away, let's do the 90s instead. Like, what? Nah, I don't reckon that's a good idea at all. So I think of the two, if there is a more substantial time skip in the works, it's going to have to be to the end of the 80s. And honestly, I think from a number of perspectives, this actually is a smart storytelling technique. For one, thematically it wraps up the show in a nice little bow. The end of the show, based in the 80s, coincides with the end of that decade. The end of their era of Hawkins getting swarmed by alternate dimension monsters led by an insane murderer. It just kind of fits. And then on top of that, we actually at last would get to see the cast members acting as characters that are somewhat close to their actual age bracket. Like, I understand for the story they didn't want to take massive gaps in the timeline, but at the same time, due to the realities of filming and then the pandemic, we're ending up with characters who are like meant to be 14, being played by actors who are ranging 17 to 20. For some characters, I think you do get away with it a little bit, but then you look at characters like Will or Lucas and it's just like, am I actually supposed to believe that you were still 14? I mean, literally any of the OG members of the party, those four boys, puberty has hit them, and it has hit them hard. So I could understand wanting to age them up to their actual chronological ages, so you don't have nearly full-grown men playing mid-teenagers. At a certain point, it starts to look and feel a little bit ridiculous. It stops you suspending your disbelief and takes you out of the story in a significant way. But for me, those are really the only reasons I can think of to have any sort of extended time skip. Otherwise, it just doesn't make sense. At least in terms of the actual narrative flow. After all, we were pretty much left with a cliffhanger ending. This isn't a case of having a post-credit scene setting up the events of the next season or having a new villain making their debut. Vecna's still around, and he's opened a massive gate through which anything can come out. Like, yeah, when you think about it, he was mauled pretty badly at the end there, but considering he was mutilated by lightning in the Upside Down and walked through that hellscape surviving for years until he found the dust, I do think it would stretch believability if he has to spend a couple of years recovering from his ordeal. What's the point of becoming an eldritch demon from another dimension if it only takes a little bit of immolation and a shotgun to take you out for a couple of years and stop your plans in their tracks just as you're about to completely obliterate humanity forever and shape the world to fit your perfect image? For me, a skip like this would mean the storyline gets derailed and it makes Vecna look pretty weak. And that's not really a good look for the major antagonist of the overarching storyline in the final season. But on top of that, it also means a lot of the other various different story threads also face that potential to be derailed or just make less sense or lose their momentum if they're subjected to a bigger skip. And that's simply because a lot of things would therefore have to happen off screen, or they'll feel like they stagnated and were held in place for years off screen so the story can play out how it's supposed to. And I think a lot of the storylines are at risk of this, but the two biggest ones are the love triangle and Max's coma. For better or for worse, based on what we've seen in season 4, a big part of the storyline is going to involve Jonathan and Nancy, and Steve and Nancy. Even when dealing with a psychic serial killer, Nancy and Steve were still giving each other the eyes, and her relationship with Jonathan's rocky at best at the end of the season. So I think it's safe to say that their dynamics are going to shift a little bit. The only problem is, this storyline needs to be addressed in the immediate future. Relationships develop rather quickly, and can shift at the drop of a penny. Skipping forward a couple of years would just make things unnecessarily convoluted and complicated, and means that we never really get to see a resolution play out on screen to any of the stuff from season 4. Because it would be ridiculous to keep a love triangle going over that many years, and if she keeps going back and forth, it just makes her look awful. I think you could get away with a couple month time skip, much like they've done every season, but any more than that, and the storyline really stretches any sort of believability. And so then this brings us to Max's storyline. And yeah, I guess being in a coma brain dead for a few years is actually a genuinely intriguing story point, but at the same time, wouldn't her muscles atrophy really badly? And she would have been left behind by her peers, and even her friends would have moved on to new phases of their lives. It would just be a little too depressing, I think. We're in the end phase, the return of the Jedi phase. For a character waking up 3 to, 5 years after her coma, what's her end game? Is it realistic to continue the Lucas romance that they continued with in season 4? Realistically, would he still be where he was at the end of season 4 after that many years? I mean, he'd probably still visit, but I feel like it would stretch believability for him to just be pining after her all this time. And it just reduces her role to being stuck in the bed, being sad at everything she's missed. And honestly, that's not really something I want to see in the final season. I would at least like a little bit of a happy ending than that. So for her to really have any sort of potential role in the season that has any relevance whatsoever, without it seeming ridiculous or forced, I think a much shorter time skip is needed for her. So yeah, long story short, a gap is fine. All the seasons have one. But it really won't make much narrative sense to have that skip jump years into the future due to a number of untied plot threads we currently have. And so, no time skip thanks. Only a couple months if you have to. It would really just make matters worse, or at least it would in my opinion. But, as I said, that's just my opinion. Now I'd like to hear yours. What do you think about a potential time skip? Good idea, bad idea, somewhere in between? I'm curious for your thoughts, so make sure to like, comment, and subscribe, and let me know.